What a great pleasure to be here. And firstly, my thanks to Father Abbot Dominic and your kindness in having us here. Father Daniel McCarthy, such generous words to start out, and what generosity you showed us here as from the Chichester workshop when we visited the first time a short while ago. Father Peter Burns, thank you to Father Peter sorting the mic out kindly. Thank you. And Maxina Studnik as well, who's done so much to make it possible for us to be here and so much behind the scenes for us. Thank you. And a pleasure to meet, albeit briefly, Professor Heldhoff before coming in to speak here today. And thank you all for coming to hear us. And I say us because, as mentioned, there are three of us who work together in the Chichester workshop. And there are amongst us here as well a number who've come to share in apprenticeship with the three of us, such that we are a shared enterprise in the liturgical arts, and in particular founding that enterprise upon the making of work and building out from that making a sharing through some academic research, some talks, some other means by which we can engage with that endeavour which we all share here today, which is the building up of liturgical arts in the church for the world. A brief summary, perhaps, of how we relate as artists might be helpful before I launch into what I've prepared today. Aidan brought together in studio Martin and myself, and we worked together in Shrewsbury or Shrewsbury for some time before, at the invitation of Chichester Cathedral, we set up the Chichester workshop in association with the cathedral. And we've been working there for a little while now, and we're aiming to move into a studio closely within the cathedral precinct in Chichester. There is opportunity to discuss that more if that's of interest to you later in the afternoon too. But that's just a brief way of saying we work together in friendship, and as Orthodox, as Catholic, and as Anglican too. I said that our work is very practical work, and so it is. It is all based from the messy struggle and joyful struggle of studio life. What I present to you here is a more academic take that is an outgrowing of that. And once again, there is opportunity both in responses and potentially in discussion to explore more quite what that practice involves in terms perhaps of the materials that we use, how the days are structured, how commissioning works, and so on. Sacred arts are, by their very nature, oriented toward the infinite beauty of God, which they attempt in some way to portray by the work of human hands. This is a passage from the Sacrosanctum Concilium. And I ask, what do you make of that phrase, in some way? As in, the sacred arts attempt in some way to portray the infinite beauty of God. And I invite us to explore this phrase, in some way, which in the Holy See's Latin is aliquo modo. The passage could simply have been read as follows: the sacred arts attempt to portray the infinite beauty of God. But it doesn't. That passage doesn't. And I submit that the insertion of this qualifying phrase, in some way, is helpful and it is creative. I'll be grounding an approach to the way in which the sacred artist portrays divine beauty in some way, not just in the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius, but also in some of the Dionysian tradition that follows upon him, and specifically in relation to a theologian 7 centuries on, and then an artist 7 centuries yet further on. A word first about Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. The pseudonym Dionysius the Areopagus. References philosopher you may well know and be very familiar with, converted through the preaching of St. Paul at the Athenian Areopagus. But still, the historical author remains unidentified, beyond a minimal consensus that he was likely a Syrian monk of the 5th and 6th centuries. His surviving corpus is relatively small. I'll refer to 3 of his works in particular: the Divine Names, the Celestial Hierarchy, the Mystical Theology. There are a few others, a number of letters, another of works that he refers to within the extant works, which we're not sure whether to be existing at that time when he wrote them or not. So that by way of a brief introduction to Pseudo-Dionysius. I'll call him Dennis for short, as he is often called, Dennis for short. And regarding the question of historical authorship, I find a persuasive a question put by, and here a Swiss topical reference, von Balthasar. Could he ever have said more than his work has said? Could he ever have said more than his work has said? The corpus of his work is, I submit, sufficient for us, at least in our context today. The ultimate sacred artist for Dennis is the hierarch, this being the bishop, the priest, the minister of the liturgical rites, who Dennis calls the divine artist in one place. Dennis writes that the attention of the hierarch in the liturgical rite is alike to that, the attention is alike to that of a perceptual artist, insofar as the hierarch makes an image of beauty, and I quote, an image of beauty within his mind, unquote. Like, he says, a painter who keeps his eye on the original, the archetype, with undivided attention. The artistry of the hierarch, the minister of the liturgical rite, consists in imaging spiritual or intellectual or noetic, as we could say, beauty. Now, the context of this analogy is a particular rite in which Dennis says this of the hierarch's image of beauty, that, quote, the concentration and persistence of this fragrant, secret beauty enables them to produce an exact likeness of God, unquote. So the hierarch conforms himself to divine beauty, imaging that fragrant divine beauty in his mind, and is thereby enabled to lead the people of God to participate themselves in these divine images, enabling the people to share in his vision, to share in the communion of saints. And the word fragrant may suggest to you the particular sacramental context in which Dennis writes here. It is the sacrament of ointment. The hidden or secret nature of this sacrament, again being the divine beauty, is signified in the perceptible liturgy by the covering of the ointment with 6 pairs of folds, which represent the order of the seraphim, the highest of the holy beings, standing in fiery assembly around Jesus. And we'll return to that liturgical image. Liturgical imagery for Dennis is fully imitative of divine beauty, but it's not the same with scriptural imagery. Much of Dennis's writings on angels in his work, The Celestial Hierarchy, is at the same time a grappling with scriptural aesthetics. By his own account, his difficulty with the absurdity of scriptural visual depiction of angels, kickstarts his way of anagogy, or a way of uplifting beyond immediate appearances. And this is of a piece with his playing out of the via negativa in relation to divine names. And for the via negativa, we could also use the phrase, the way up through negations, or the apophatic way, the way away from speech, the way of unsaying. This quality of scriptural imagery, which Dennis calls an intentional, quote, unlike likeness, unquote, in the context of an overall apophatic theology, has given rise to criticism of an all too intellectual character to his work insufficiently affirmative of materiality. And one scholar, and this is Cornelius Sakiridou, a wonderful writer on matters including icons. One scholar suggests nicely that his notion of theophany, Dennis's notion of theophany, is, she says, intellective in terms of its origin and photic in terms of its end, having an abstract and detached quality. Now, while not unanswerable, this argument has, I think, force, and it's part of the reason why I've chosen to venture into the wider reception of Dennis's thought through the ages, rather than stick solely to his own texts. And already at this point, in reflection on Dennis's writings, I want to offer some observations in relation to this aliquo modo, the in some way of the Sacrosanctum Concilium. Firstly, this in some way needs to serve the liturgical rites. Now, this may sound obvious, but it raises the question to what extent it is true for the sacred arts in practice, this relation to the liturgical rites. Secondly, the hierarch is well placed to judge the effectiveness of sacred art's portrayal of divine beauty, because the hierarch himself attends most fully to divine beauty, in conformity to which other forms of beauty may be judged. Now, this does presume that the hierarch, the bishop, the priest, lives out the inner liturgical rite with undivided attention. And I question whether Dennis, or why Dennis, is not subject to more critique in this regard. He gives such a very high view of the priestly capacity and example. But whichever way, with regard to Dennis, the priest rightly has a key role. And as in Sacrosanctum Concilium, here number 127, bishops should, and I quote, have a special concern for artists, so as to imbue them with the spirit of sacred art and of the sacred liturgy. Now, a third point in reflection on Dennis's writings in relation to the aliquo modo, and only hinted at, there's an extraordinarily dynamic at play in the way of aesthetic unlike likeness and the via negativa together that informs sacred art's portrayal of beauty. And I want to explore this last point more fully now by turning to intoxication and turning my mind to getting the slides on in the right order. That first cross was one we'll come back to, and I'll explain. Here, St. Denis himself, portrayed in the monastic Catholicon of Hosius Lucas in Greece. This is St. Denis the Areopagus, with gold mosaic surrounding him. Oh, thank you, Father. There's just one, and this will be on for some time. Okay. By turning to intoxication and seeing this as Pentecost may already create a link in your mind. But first, be drunk, we hear in the Song of Songs. Be drunk with love. I have become like a drunkard, like one overcome with wine, says Jeremiah, because of the Lord and because of his holy words. And we also hear Paul in the letter to the Ephesians. do not get drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. And we hear Peter at Pentecost. Peter, Paul. St. Peter, St. Paul. Upon accusations of new wine in the morning, going straight to the prophet Joel's, I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. Dennis addresses this scriptural language of drunkenness in ways that give insight into the sacred artist's work. While acknowledging that inebriation, as usually considered, has the pejorative meaning of being out of one's mind and wits, Dennis goes on to say that inebriation has a better meaning when applied to God. And here we might take the Song of Songs, the first verse of the 5th chapter, to be a scriptural warrant. As applied to God, inebriation, he says, quote, must be understood as nothing other than the measureless superabundance of delights unfathomable to the mind. And I repeat, the measureless superabundance of delights unfathomable to the mind. And as an aside, I think his use of the word delights is revealing. The Greek here for delight is euchia. The translation for which, given in the patristic Greek dictionary of Lamp, is feasting of heavenly or eschatological banquet. And so it's used by Clement of Alexandria and John Chrysostom and others. And furthermore, Dennis also describes this delight, this euchia, as flowing from the wisdom of God. Wisdom in turn being praised as the one who makes perfect, the telesiogos. And a word in its own turn being associated with sacrament, teletis. Such that, and I think it may work through this lively current of meanings, Dennis is offering a play between drunkenness and the Eucharistic rite with reference to wine in particular. And I offer this little aside on this flow of meanings, partly to explore and express quite how playful and joyful Dennis is in his writing, and as a way, hopefully, of advocating for returning to his writing to find in him that delight. He is a theologian replete with joy, of a dynamic that leads to brightness and indeed to light. Anyway, back to the thought that originated that aside. Scriptural description of intoxication encourages the capacity for delightful yet unfathomable vision of the divine. And recalling what Dennis says of being out of one's mind and wits, he elsewhere exhorts us to be, and I quote again, wholly taken out of ourselves, so as to become wholly of God. Because, he says, it is better to belong to God than to belong to ourselves. Now, this is ecstasy, understood as standing outside of ourselves. Only when we are taken out of ourselves, continues Dennis, only when we belong to God will the divine gifts be poured upon us. And these divine gifts are themselves phenomena of God's own, and this from Dennis, drunken superabundance as the cause of all, God's own ecstatic outpouring. There is here both an exhortation to ecstatic transcendence on the part of the believer and an ecstatic bestowal of gifts on the part of God. There is mutual ecstasy. It is in such an ecstatic condition of being that the sacred minister presides, and indeed in which the sacred artist creates their work in service to Christ's presence within the liturgical rites. And the dynamic of this mutual ecstasy within the liturgical rites gives a certain shape to liturgical art, which we'll explore further now as we move into, beyond Dennis's own writings, the Dionysian tradition. And we'll move on 7 centuries to Saint Bonaventure, and then another 7 to Olivier Messiaen. Can I go? Okay. Thank you. In Bonaventure's account of St. Francis's life, Bonaventure writes that St. Francis, when receiving Holy Communion, was often wrapped in ecstasy, as if drunk in spirit. So we're in familiar territory. In another place, he describes St. Francis flying along, as if drunk in spirit, on the road to St. Francis's anticipated martyrdom in Morocco. And for more on the experiences of St. Francis, I also want to incorporate consideration of an artwork much influenced by Bonaventure's account, the musical spectacle that is Olivier Messiaen's Saint François d'Assise. Messiaen's massive work premiered in 1983. It was not designed specifically for church, and as such is not liturgical art. And here I'm going to borrow a categorization from Aidan. Not, properly speaking, liturgical art, but we could consider it threshold art. Art which occupies the threshold between the stage and the sanctuary. This Messiaen's work is not a life of St. Francis in biographical terms. Rather, as according to its title, which continues Scènes franciscaines, my French, forgive pronunciation, Franciscan scenes, is a series of these Franciscan scenes for which Messiaen himself wrote the libretto. He considered calling Act 1, Scene 1, Perfect Joy, but he in fact called it the Cross. In this scene, this first scene, Messiaen marks out a series of steps in which St. Francis guides Brother Leo in a kind of via negativa. And the structure for the dialogue between these two friars is akin to that of responsorial liturgy, consisting of accumulating verse-response units. And in it, St. Francis responds 3 times to Brother Leo's versed despair, raising Brother Leo up to an appreciation of perfect joy. Even if, St. Francis starts, you, Brother Leo, were master of all knowledge, could prophesy by revealing the future, and read the secrets of hearts. This is not perfect happiness, not perfect joy. And then second, even if, St. Francis continues, and I paraphrase, you were to know the language of angels, the qualities of creation, even if you preached until all were converted, and even if you lived in greatest holiness, all this is not happiness, not perfect joy. And third, says St. Francis, that alone for which, he says, we may glorify ourselves is the cross, tribulation, affliction, the cross of Jesus Christ. In the cross alone is perfect joy. And at this point on the stage, there's a light that gradually intensifies on a great black cross, fully lighting it up. And the culmination of this via negativa, then, is itself a moment of ecstasy. Christ's reviving crucifixion is an event of God's ecstatic outpouring of love, and our very receiving of it is in itself an ecstatic turning to Christ. Now, so far, in Messiaen's libretto, St. Francis has used just words. Later, we know St. Francis is to suffer these words in his body, as you see in the painting by Giotto. In the building up to his stigmatization, we hear in Messiaen's chorus words of the divinity as follows: if thou wishest truly to love me, thou must suffer in thy body the 5 wounds. Thou must suffer in thy body the 5 wounds of my body on the cross, in union with my sacrifice, and always surpassing thyself, like a higher music. Union with Christ and infinite self-surpassing exist in one and the same moment. Now, Messiaen portrays the suffering of the stigmata in excelling sound and light, but few words. St. Bonaventure gives a verbal description of the event. He writes that a seraph with 6 fiery wings descended from heaven to a spot in the air near St. Francis. And I quote from St. Bonaventure, "There appeared between the wings of the seraph the figure of a man crucified. Francis was overwhelmed, and his heart was flooded with a mixture of joy and sorrow." Note that at the same time, St. Francis rejoiced at the way that Christ looked at him, and he sorrowed at Christ's crucifixion. And then immediately on the body of St. Francis, the marks of nails began to appear. Bonaventure, some 3.5 decades after this event that he recounts, himself went to a place on Mount Laverna where Francis received the stigmata. And Bonaventure received a vision of the event, which he interpreted to be a description of the road by which rapture is reached. What Bonaventure understood as he wrote was that, and I quote, "The 6 wings of the seraph can rightly be taken to symbolize the 6 levels of illumination by which, as if by steps or stages, the soul can pass over to peace through ecstatic elevations of Christian wisdom. There is no other path but through the burning love of the crucified." So we've considered ecstatic intoxication, and here is ecstatic illumination. Bonaventure's 6 levels of illumination, as written in his book, The Soul's Journey into God, are graded through and beyond the realms of creation, up through the names of God, up into an ecstasy which he describes by citing at length from a core work by Dennis, The Mystical Theology, and including this, that, quote, "transcending yourself and all things by an immeasurable and absolute ecstasy of a pure mind, you will ascend to the super-essential ray of divine darkness." Bonaventure, centering upon Francis's vision at his stigmatization, emphasizes the cross to be at the very heart of Dionysian theology, of Denis's theology. And as such, the fiery, seraphic surroundings of the cross become the ecstatic illuminations. What was latent in Denis's contemplation of the sacrament of ointment that we heard and visioned earlier has here flourished in a glorious vision of human transfiguration, marked out in mind, in body, and in spirit, and in all the levels of the created order. And by this account, the way of mutual ecstasy demands far more of the sacred artist than simply the construction of a play of apophatic signifiers. Far more than this, the demand upon the sacred artist is for the artist to be willing, flesh, mind, and soul, to deny themselves so as to enter into the self-giving life of the one whom ultimately they draw, or they paint, or they sculpt. That is to say, to enter into the life of Christ crucified, risen, glorified. By this account, the artist's agony and their joy will not be in their learning of techniques, nor in the success of their work in the eyes of others, nor even in the sharing of their methods. Their agony and their joy will be just as it is for all who come before Christ. Their way too will be the way of the cross, with hope in the one who comes to them in rays of dazzling darkness. Entering into sacred art as artist, and also, I submit, and here to use the words of the Sacrosanctum Concilium, and also as commissioner and as appreciator, is a sharing in this challenge. And this has implications for the selection of artists by churches. And at this point, with these materials in place, I want to shift the focus from the sacred minister and the sacred artist to the sacred art object, whether this sacred art object be oral, heard, or visual, seen. The manner in which the sacred object will portray divine beauty and the capacity of the object to do so will reflect the quality of soul of the artist and of the tradition in which the artist creates. And we have seen that quality in Denis and in Dionysian tradition to be one of dynamic mutual ecstasy embodied in the cross at the center of all creation and the taking up of the cross of life. We have also seen this mutual ecstasy insistently transcending our knowing and yet being affirmed in corporeality. And these two moments of transcendence and corporeality are not separate but are one and the same movement in space or moment in time. Now, Denis, for all the dazzling darkness of his theological vision, affirms the value of art along the way, albeit in concessionary terms. Scripture, he says, makes use of poetic imagery, but does not do so for the sake of art, but as a concession to the nature of our mind, unquote. And the concession here is no denigration of art, but an alignment of art to the very highest ordering of human existence, and that is to say, to deification. Art's use of absurdity, as necessarily the case in angelic depiction, is an element of art's value in challenging conventional perception in the face of the universal vocation to transcendent deification, to a life in this world, but not of this world. And Messiaen's thought resonates here. Messiaen places on St. Francis's lips, as he lays dying with the assurance of paradisiacal resurrection, these words: Lord, music and poetry have led me to thee. By image, by symbol, and in absence of truth. Lord, illumine me with thy presence. Deliver me, enrapture me, dazzle me forever with the excess of thy truth. So on the one hand, music and poetry lead us to God, in Messiaen's interpretation of St. Francis's life, but absent truth. On the other hand, God delivers us with his excess of truth. Messiaen's explanation of these words in a conversation with Claude Samuel brings more clarity. Music, Messiaen says, expresses the beyond with its absence of truth, because the beyond it isn't inside the actual framework of reality. God alone is the single true reality, a reality so true that it surpasses all truth. So Messiaen asserts, in I think a very Dionysian manner, art's absence of truth in the face of the all-surpassing truth of God. At the same time, he maintains that art leads us to God. He was himself a sacred artist proper as a musician within the liturgy, alongside producing what I earlier termed threshold art on a grand scale. I believe his own compositions show that art leads us to God. But even if this is not accepted, their content alone affirms the serious theological value he places upon the art object. And one could, I think, say much the same for the artistry evident in Denis's writings. What we observe in each case here is not a diminution of art or any abolition of finitude and form, but an honouring of the mystery of the divine abyss and God's transcendence in the context of a positive evaluation of art's sacred function. And this is where I think the via negativa can easily be misunderstood, for throughout all its transcendent negation, fundamental Christian form remains. And here the wounds of the risen Christ, I think, offer profound justification for the sacred artist's work and its modes. And interestingly for Messiaen, St. Francis's words in response to his stigmatization were, "My Lord and my God." The words of St. Thomas, as he recognizes the risen Christ in the wounds from his crucifixion. The image before you here, which I offer with some trepidation, I believe, shows this very justification internalized within the art object. And I say with some trepidation because I assisted Martin in painting this cross within the Chichester workshop. But we work within a confident tradition, besides that trepidation. And Martin's design here for St. Mary's Cathedral, Aberdeen, which we'll speak of, Martin, you'll mention in more practical terms, a later 3 meters high, suspended cross over the altar, double-sided, traditional use of gesso, natural pigment, tempera, egg yolk, to make it. This cross is, as according to the brief from the cathedral, an interpretation of the San Damiano cross before which St. Francis received his commission to rebuild the church. So in this one image, Christ dies, Christ is risen, Christ's wounds continue to nourish. And Christ's return is signified. The embodiment which we've seen at the heart of the Dionysian vision, most clearly perhaps in the work of St. Bonaventure, is affirmed here in a vision which incorporates space-time transformation in materiality. And the Dionysian principles that we've been exploring of sober intoxication and dazzling darkness in particular, and sorrowful joy in the human face, that mixture of sorrow and joy is recorded by Bonaventure in its description of St. Francis, may surely inform the tenor of different styles of sacred art across the cultures. And here another resonance with Sacrosanctum Concilium in the church adopting various styles of art. The artist's challenge in whatever style is to maintain these paradoxes: sober intoxication, dazzling darkness, sorrowful joy. Paradoxical, and I submit so because they are given space and even encouraged in that intriguing word, aliquo modo, in some way, that in some way perhaps opens up the space for these paradoxes to live in us and all who receive the liturgical rites. And finally, if the church is full of such sorrowful, joyful art, then this will also fulfill the will of Abbot Biscop, who, as we understand through the recorded details of St. Bede, wanted everyone who entered the church he was building, wherever they turned their eyes, to have before them the lovable faces of Christ and his saints.
Thank you, James, for your profound and thoughtful contemplative presentation. We'll break for tea. When we come back at on the hour at 4, then Martin Earle and then Aidan Hart will give brief responses, and then we'll open the floor to discussion. We'll begin with a response from Martin Earle, who is a member of the Chichester workshop. Martin is a Roman Catholic and helped with the new crucifix in Aberdeen. And the thing I've pointed out is people talk about the orientation of a church and the sun and all that. This crucifix is mounted in the church in a way that it faces the sun at the 9th hour of the day, which is mid-afternoon, which is the hour in which our Lord died on the cross. And so it's just a lovely cosmic reference for this crucifix. So Martin, the word to you.
Thanks, Jim, for those words. And I love those kind of lively paradoxes that you identify as a defining characteristic of Christian sacred art: sorrow and joy, drunkenness and illumination, affirmation of the finite, and awe before God's utter transcendence. And I particularly enjoyed that you began speaking about the via negativa, and you finished by speaking about tangible and lovable faces. So they seem to be words bubbling with that kind of creative spirit which aliquamondo, or in some way, evoke. And thank you especially for describing something of the strangeness of Christian form. The scriptural vision of the seraphim appears absurd, but the strangest vision of all was surely that written not in scripture, but in the flesh, the word written perfectly by the second person of the Holy Trinity. God, the utterly transcendent and unknowable, born into frail flesh, born in a cave among animals, bound in swaddling cloths, and held in a young mother's arm. God, the creator of all creatures, visible and invisible, become a hill country carpenter. God, the all-powerful, expiring on the cross. What could be stranger? And it's these strange yet entirely real forms of the incarnation that inform our making in the studio. Not only the content, but also in the processes we use and our way of being as artists, our service in both spirit and body. And the studio Jim and I currently share at the Chichester workshop has some of the characteristics of the cave of Bethlehem. Allow me to be very practical. It's cold for much of the year. It's darker than we'd like it to be. And sometimes it's as damp as it possibly could be. Strange creatures lurk within it. Stranger than the seraphim, more ragged than the shepherd at times. Men and women, artists. It's the space in which Jim and I, helped by several other artists and also apprentices, painted this rood for St. Mary's Catholic Cathedral in Aberdeen, and that was last year that we completed it. The first step in its creation was to construct a timber panel which was over 9 feet tall and weighed about 150 kilos. So I think that's about 300 pounds or thereabouts, maybe 330. So far, so good. The next stage in the process was to create the perfectly smooth white plaster surface on which to paint and gild. This process of plastering or gessoing is time-consuming, especially on a work so large, and also in this case, double-sided, twice the work. So we set aside 3 weeks for 2 men to complete the task. But in the exquisite dampness of our studio in March, a step of the gessoing process which should have taken a day took 3 days, including 2 nighttime shifts. And on the 3rd day, we arrived in the studio bleary-eyed, expecting this beautiful luminous surface, and instead we found a surface damp and grey, buckling and crackling all over. When you work with the stuff of matter, disaster is never far away. And so I laughed to myself when Jim recounted that Messiaen had originally thought to call the first act of his Franciscan opera Perfect Joy, and then decided instead on calling it The Cross. How often have we artists begun a new project with enthusiasm and anticipation, only to find ourselves mired in all kinds of frustrations and failures? I can't believe it always must be the case. Scripture uses the image of the craftsman at play in God's presence, an image which evokes freedom and joy in making. Nevertheless, for us beginners at least, the experience of failure is often forefront. But might it be, just maybe, that these failures and even disasters have about them something of the ecstatic quality which Jim has spoken of? Our materials and processes warn us against levitation. They pull us from our thrones. They continually teach us to attend to what is actually happening, to attend to reality, to study, to seek expertise, to seek help. In other words, to go out of ourselves and thereby to receive gifts. We poured boiling water over the failed gesso surface of our crucifix. We scratched and scraped away a foul-smelling sludge, and then we strapped the whole thing onto the back of a borrowed pickup truck and drove it across a wet field in search of a warmer place to gesso, a borrowed kitchen in someone's house, ali quo modo in some way, in whatever way possible. How much creative grafting and improvisation and larking around is covered by that term, in some way. So this rude cross, this crucifix, was the work of not one artist, but of many hands. And as such, the project had another ecstatic quality to it. In making it, we were formed, often by failures, into a little community gathered around the cross, by necessity, recognizing our limits and going out of ourselves in our need for help, support, and encouragement. And so, like the cave in Bethlehem, our studio is a space which is as once heavenward and earthward bound. That's the strange essence of Christian form, service in spirit, but in body also, where neither is denied the body and the world of things, or God's transcendence. In our studio, an unlikely and sometimes ragged community gathers, like the hill shepherds who gathered around in the cave around the form of the Word made flesh. And it is there also that we often find ourselves surrounded by lovable faces. So that's my contribution.
Aidan Hart takes the lead in the Chichester workshop, an Orthodox Christian and sometime resident on Mount Athos in Greece, and very familiar with the contemplative and monastic traditions. Aidan, please.
Well, it's a joy to be back here. I feel I'm quite a frequent visitor to Ealing Abbey. It's always a joy to hear Jim speak. Jim and I shared a studio for how many, 2 or 3 years, I think, and I just loved our conversation. So, and Martin as well. It was a real joy to hear what you had to say, Martin. Thank you. What I found particularly illuminating in your talk, Jim, was that whilst an icon is like, that's the meaning of the word icon, is like, it's also unlike, as the wonderful description that Martin gave of the making of the cross. As artists, we're dealing with stuff, with matter we can see and touch and smell. But we need to be continually reminded that, as you say, and quoting Dionysius, the icon is both unlike as well as like. So I want to expand a bit on what Jim said by giving some examples of how liturgical art reminds us that it is only an image, an icon, a door, a mediator, and not the reality itself. And then I want to pick up a little bit on what you said, that it's not just the artist who needs to touch something of heaven, which we are reflecting in our work, but also the commissioner, the priest or whoever is commissioning work, because what's the use of us liturgical artists if we're not commissioned? So I'd like to outline a few ways in which liturgical art, and here I'm not just talking about panel icons, but the whole of liturgical art, the smells, the way light is used, indicate something beyond itself. So first of all, the face of icons. You're looking at a face, so you know that this is Christ or St. John or St. Mary, but also there's something unusual about the way traditional liturgical art depicts this face. There's something abstract about it. The eyes are a bit bigger. The light is unusual. It's not chiaroscuro. So you're reminded that you see the face of Christ, but you realize there's something else about this depiction of Christ. He's more than what is apparent. Christ is on the cross, but also he's alive. He's dead, but his hands are embracing death. The proportions of the figures here, there's something unusual about them. An extreme example, as Jim told us, is the weird descriptions of angels and the seraphim and the cherubim and these weird wheels with eyes and with the wings spinning around. I remember trying to understand what was being described of these strange wheels within wheels, and you can't get your head around it. And that's the whole idea, that these visual descriptions in the Bible aren't to tell us what heaven is like. It's to blow our brains and say heaven can't be imagined. It's to be known, not imagined. Secondly, liturgical art traditionally has a certain flatness about it. This depicts the body of Christ, so there's a certain amount of modeling. At the same time, it's flattened. The image is telling us that I'm a door, but I'm not the reality. You came here through a door, then you forget the door, don't you? You're here now, you forget the door. There's this imperfection in liturgical art that tells us that it's pointing to something beyond. And this is really important. This imperfection is something quite deliberate in the icon. This leads us to the third way in which liturgical art points to the strangeness of life with God. That's the various perspective systems used in icons. It's quite common in secular writing to say, the wonderful Renaissance discovered perspective. But in fact, the icon tradition has about 6 different types of perspective. And one of them, obviously, is the inverse perspective everyone writes about. So we are being contemplated by God through the image. So the lines of perspective converge on us. But it has multi-view perspective. It will view a building from the front, the left, and the right, and above all at once. That just blows your brain. God is not restricted to our time and our space. And finally, talking about the larger picture, architecture. The architecture of a traditional church uses as much darkness as it does light. I gave a talk yesterday at Cardiff, and preparing for this, I was rereading Genesis 1 and 2. And it struck me on the first day, God created light. And I was going to say, well, God wants us to see, so he creates light. But then I realized he also created darkness. Light and dark go hand in hand. The knowability and the unknowability of God. And in Orthodox theology, we have these two terms. Ousia, God's essence, is completely unknowable and will remain unknowable forever. God's light and energy and grace comes to us, and that's knowable. But if I know my wife, I've known her for 20 years, but I don't know her. And immediately I think, I know her, then I've lost her. I must always have in mind the otherness of my wife and of God. I must remind myself she's unlike my image of her as much as she is like my image of her. So I'd like to finish picking up what Jim said really importantly. He says, entering into sacred art as artist, and also, I submit, as a commissioner and appreciator, it is a sharing in this challenge of the cross. So what 2 things does the commissioner have to have in mind when they commission a new church, or refiguring the church, or some new work of art? First, I think they must remind the architect or the artist that you're not making something original out of your fantasy. What we're making is a reflection of heavenly worship. People are entering church to participate in the ceaseless worship of heaven. You're not inventing something. You'll do something that's new in the sense it's a response to a particular church, a cathedral in this case. It had to be big. If Martin had been commissioned to make a cross for this building, it wouldn't have been that big. It would have been a different scale. In that sense, it's new. But in a more profound sense, it's reflecting something that exists already. And the second thing a commissioner must have in mind, that they want the painting or carving, whatever it is, to reflect a transfigured world, not a world just seen as a bush, but a bush that's burning with that uncreated light. Just imagine how strange it was for Moses, walking along, and he sees the bush burning. Probably not that unusual in a hot country, but he looks at this bush and it's burning but not being consumed. How weird is that? So he approaches this strange sight and God speaks to him. And the whole history of the Old Testament is transformed because of this strange beauty, this burning bush, which attracts him, and God speaks to him, and Israel is delivered into the promised land. Thank you.